In this lecture, we explore the transition to the Renaissance. As we saw looking at Gothic architecture, both Chartres and then Reims, there was a move in the north in sculpture toward medieval humanism. What we see, though, is that it lagged behind in painting, perhaps because sculpture was three-dimensional, and so in a way it was more convincing to begin with because sculptures were rounded three-dimensional, but for whatever reason, painting lagged behind. These are a couple of examples. This is a wall painting actually from Spain, and it's telling the story of David and Goliath. Goliath's body here, I don't know what's going on. It's supposed to be chainmail, I suppose, but it looks like a sack of potatoes. It's very, very awkward. Notice the scale between the head and the hand. The hand is actually larger than the head. And as David has killed Goliath, he is now chopping off his head. Is he lifting him up off the ground? That would seem likely. Or is Goliath lying down? We just aren't sure. Similarly, in this example, we have a castle scene, and the castle itself is very awkward. You'll notice parts of it are pretty convincing, and then towers seem to be tilting somewhat, and especially over here, it just looks very awkward, not very convincing. And the soldiers are actually larger or almost as large as the building. So they're attempting to show some depth. For example, these soldiers are meant to be closer to us than the building, and the castle then is closer to us than the buildings behind that. But it's very awkward, not really very true to the eye. And in this example, which is a masterpiece from Italy from the Middle Ages, but you'll notice the gold background, and that was a very common convention in Italy during this time period, but again, it isn't realistic. The person who starts bringing change to painting is Giotto. The way I like to say it is that he wakes painting up. He has been nicknamed the father of Western painting. A good example of his work comes from this chapel in northern Italy. It's called the Arena Chapel, or sometimes it's called by the name of the people who paid for it, the donors. It's called the Scrovegni Chapel. As you see, the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, Italy. We could really say that this chapel was paid for with guilt money. The situation was, you see this man here presenting actually the chapel as a gift. His father was heavily involved in usury, which is a fancy word for money lending, which was considered a sin at this point. Dante actually puts this man's father by name in the 7th circle of hell for his sin of usury. And so the son takes some of that money and pays for this chapel. And Giotto here has painted that part of the story where Scrovegni is presenting the chapel to God, as it were. But we go inside where, as you see, Giotto has covered the walls with beautiful color, lots of rich blue in particular, but you see these panels with various scenes from the life of Christ and the life of Mary. We will be focusing, I'll have a panel zeroing in on a couple of these. Our work, which is the most famous, is right here. That's the one we'll be looking at. So again, zeroing in, here we see 4 panels. Again, as I said, the life of Christ, the life of Mary. This is Christ's first miracle, the changing of water into wine. Here we have actually 2 resurrection scenes. There is another miracle of Christ with the resurrection of Lazarus, and then we see also Christ's resurrection. The focus painting takes place before that, the Lamentation. That is another term. We've used terms such as annunciation, the announcement when the angel comes to tell Mary she's to be the mother of Christ. Another one of these labels is the lamentation. And that simply means that Christ has been crucified, his body has been taken down from the cross, and his followers are lamenting his death, hence the name lamentation. So here we see the work. I'll be walking through some key elements in just a moment, but you see here Christ's body cradled by Mary, and then you see various mourners gathered round. There's an outcropping of rock with a tree, and in the sky even the angels are grieving. So as I said, this is a very famous example, and it's a good example of what I call Giotto waking art up. He is moving toward naturalism. This is the early 1300s, about 1305 to 1306. And again, he's moving in the direction that we had already seen happening earlier in sculpture in the North. But he's now giving us increased naturalism as well. A number of things are going on to make the art more convincing. And by the way, we think that he was possibly influenced by theater. At this point, it was very common in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance to tell Bible stories with plays. And he no doubt would have seen a lot of those, and this, you could almost imagine this as a scene from a play, has a little bit of the theatrical about it, and even we have a hint of a little bit of scenery and gestures, and everyone's sort of organized the way you might expect in the telling of the story in theater. So we see gestures as people are grieving. Some people are putting their hands just up to their faces or throwing them out to the sides in dismay. Some people are trying to be more stoic, but also sort of clasping their hands. But we see even there the expression of emotion, and we see it even with the angels with various gestures. We see also facial expressions, quite often, again, grief, pain, sorrow, dismay. We also see bodies beneath the drapery. There's a sense of rounded, three-dimensional quality here. You see these people closest to us, for example, and you get a sense of their heads, their shoulders, their backs, and so they look very convincing. One of the ways he achieves this is by shading, and this is a new word, an Italian term, chiaroscuro, and that simply means light, dark, or in other words, shading. And that's one of the ways that he suggests bodies under the drapery and makes objects look rounded and three-dimensional. So he's using shading as one of his techniques. He also allows objects to cast shadows. We don't see that a whole lot here, but we do a little bit, for example, with this man's foot, his shoe. You see the foot, and then you see the shadow on the ground. And that will also be increasingly popular with artists, both shading on objects and objects casting shadows. We saw this with the ancient Romans, with the still life with peaches and water jug, but then in the Middle Ages they got away from that. So we now see shading, we see shadows, and we see approximate depth. We will be talking in a little bit about the development of linear perspective. In the early 1300s, we aren't there yet. Giotto is using what we call approximate perspective. I like to sort of say with slang that he eyeballs it. He uses his eyes to do the best he can. He is conscious of and aware that he would like to show depth on a flat surface, but he doesn't have a mathematical technique. He doesn't have a precise method for that. He doesn't know one, so he does the best he can. So at times, his depth is very convincing. We sense here, for example, these people are closer to us than Christ, then Mary, then these mourners, then the outcropping of rock. So there are spots where it seems really pretty well done and pretty convincing. And then we see all of these people back here who are in a clump, almost as if they're stepping on each other's toes. And so in that case, it isn't so successful, isn't so convincing. So again, he's just doing the best he can without having an established method. So we just call it approximate. But the bottom line with Giotto is that he is observing this world. So increasingly, even when they're portraying a Bible story or something else that happened long ago that they did not actually witness, artists are making the effort to make the art believable, visually convincing. And he also focuses on the human aspects of the story. A couple more things to point out. The term focal point, you're no doubt aware of. It simply means, of course, where the focus is, the most important part. And the focal point here would be with Mary and Christ. And so we have this focal point. Some people have pointed out that it's interesting. The focal point is down low. And it almost, we would use the modern term, something is a downer, something is sad. And it does almost pull us down emotionally because the focus is down low, and of course it is a sorrowful story, a sorrowful moment, and so it does have something of that heaviness visually and emotionally to it. We do see now a blue sky, and so we're transitioning toward, again, the mindset of let's be accurate, let's be realistic. And then one of my favorite touches is over here with this tree. I mentioned that theater may have been an inspiration, somewhat of an inspiration for Giotto, and that if he saw plays, there probably would have been some scenery, some sets that would have been included. And when we first look at this, we might assume that that is what the tree is there for as well, that this outcropping of rock and the tree are just to provide some nice background, some nice scenery, and they do that. But there's more to it than that, and I find it really brilliant. It was sort of a tradition that at the fall of man, when Adam and Eve sinned and were expelled from the Garden of Eden, it was believed that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil had withered. And so that is what this tree represents. So it is a reminder of the consequences of the fall. And so in a very subtle, but I think brilliant way, Giotto has linked the fall to what has happened here. And so it's a way of saying, without using words, without some sort of a text, he's saying this, the fall, necessitated Christ's death. And so I think it's just a really beautiful connection, a very sort of subtle one, but observers at the time no doubt would have gotten that because they were so used to hearing this tradition about the withering of the tree. And so they would have seen that and understood what it meant. The situation then is that Giotto is really onto something. He comes up with some fantastic ideas in the early 1300s that will prove to be very influential on artists in the future. He is working toward realism, toward making art more visually convincing, with shading, shadows, bodies under the drapery, approximate perspective, gestures, facial expressions, all of those things. But unfortunately, all of that will be put on the back burner for most of the 1300s. I called attention to the fact he was working in the early 1300s with that painting around 1305, 1306. So he gets some wonderful things started. You can almost think of it as like on a stove when it's on the back burner. And those ideas are going to be simmering for the rest of the century. But it's a very difficult century. And even though some art will be created, most people are focusing on other things, in particular just survival. One historian has referred to the 1300s as the calamitous 14th century, and it really was. There were many, many challenges. Floods and famine. Some scholars believe that there was an example of global warming. It got unusually cold in Northern Europe, and that led to floods, and then that led to famine. There was a war between France and England. It actually lasted longer than 100 years, but the so-called 100 Years' War, that was very devastating, particularly in France. There was a plague, the Black Death. Scholars estimate that 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe died, and they did not know why. Interestingly, they did understand social distancing. They did understand that it helped if you were able to get out of the city and that sort of a thing. There were those who would distance themselves. They understood that it was good to get away, but they did not know what was causing it. And so there was tremendous uncertainty during this time and unrest and just total upheaval with all of the death that was happening. If that weren't enough, there was a terrible split in the church. There was a controversy, started really over taxes and the leader of France wanting to establish someone who would be the Pope, who would do his bidding. Ultimately, he placed a Pope in the south of France instead of being located in Rome, and you ultimately had 2 and sometimes 3 different people claiming to be the Pope. So there was tremendous uncertainty and unrest in the church. Of course, it was eventually resolved, but so much going on in terms of floods, famine, war, illness, church controversy, that again, the result for culture was relative stagnation. Most people had other things to worry about, and so art really was not as much of a priority. Things settled down, though, around 1400, and we do have the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, as you see roughly from 1400 until 1600. The term Renaissance, French Renaissance, means rebirth, and what it refers to specifically is a rebirth of interest in the Greco-Roman world, looking back with great admiration, feeling that a lot could be learned from the Greco-Roman world. One author has referred to this time period as an adventure of the mind, and very much just like the ancient classical Greeks, that is the focus. There are other things as well, but in particular on the mind. So we once again have that, we think of that pendulum or the scales. The emphasis in this era is on the intellect. The mood of the time, and maybe we can understand after the difficulties of the 1300s, there's a tremendous energy. There is confidence. There's a can-do spirit. And what I mean by that is a sense we can figure things out. If there's a challenge, we can put our minds to it and figure out how to fix the problem or how to take care of whatever the situation might be. So energy, confidence, a can-do spirit. And the focus is on this world. As I like to put it, their thinking was something along the lines of, heaven sounds great, but what's the hurry? What I mean by that is that the average Italian, and that's where we are right now, is in the Italian Renaissance, would certainly identify as Christian. They would have gone to church all the time, probably daily. So they still very much were interested in faith. They certainly still believed in heaven and hell, and they certainly were hoping to go to heaven. But there's more and more what I mean by what's the hurry. The thinking is, yes, that sounds good, and we certainly do want to be thinking about those things, thinking about heavenly things, but more and more the focus was on enjoying life now in this world. So we do say that the Renaissance is born in Florence. Circumstances really just came together. A lot of things clicked during this time period. A big part of it was location. Florence was sort of in the middle of Italy along a major trade route between Rome and Northern Europe. And so anytime there was a lot of trade during this time, as well as religious traffic and other things. And so Florence was a great stopping point along the way. And so they were in a wonderful location. They were on a river, and they also were in this wonderful spot between north and south, which meant there was a lot of trade, a lot of folks passing through, a lot of market for your goods, all of those things. So we end up with a lot of trade, a lot of also spreading of ideas, the exchange of ideas as people are coming and going. There ends up being tremendous wealth. There were various industries in particular that they focused on. Textiles. That was the way the Medici had made a lot of their fortune, was through the woolen trade. And so they would end up sort of everything from starting with the sheep all the way to dyeing the cloth and then exporting it around Europe. And so the textiles, leather, metals, a lot of jewelry, for example, metalworking, and ultimately optics, grinding lenses, later on for eyeglasses and telescopes, microscopes, those kinds of things. But those were the kinds of industries they were heavily involved in, and a number of people became quite wealthy, including the significant patrons, the Medici family, who in many cases were true lovers of the arts, but who also understood that art could be a way to get your name out there, to be a patron of art as a gift to the city. And so it was also a bit of a propaganda move on the part of the Medici, because it was a way, again, to get their name out there and to be viewed favorably in the community by supporting the arts. Now, a bit more about Renaissance humanism, this focus on the things of this world. I like to say that they're asking questions at this point. Many people end up with a bit more leisure, with, again, more wealth. They're more comfortable, and so they're able to ask some of these questions and to pursue what we would call the good life. And so they're asking, how should we live? What does it mean to live well? The man whose image you see here was Castiglione, who wrote a book called The Courtier. The painting here is by the great artist Raphael. But Castiglione wrote a book called The Courtier, which was really for young men. It was how to be a gentleman. And he talks, for example, he says at one point that he is not pleased with the gentleman if he cannot sing and play an instrument well. And so, of course, I like to hear that sort of thing. But he's talking about how to cultivate yourself. How do you develop yourself and pursue the good life? So that's the sort of thing they're thinking about a lot during this time. Two statements that I think are helpful from modern day art historians. Fierro says, for humanists, life on earth was not a vale of tears. Now, of course, that's what, especially in the Romanesque, it had been seen. You just sort of suffer through life and look forward to the next life. That is your main focus. So at this point, for humanists, life on earth was not a vale of tears, but rather an extended occasion during which human beings might cultivate, there's that word again, their unique talents and abilities. Humanists viewed their intellectual mission as both pleasing to God and advantageous to society in general. So this idea of cultivating oneself was really stressed. Another author has said the study of God, the supreme being, which had been a focus of the Middle Ages, was replaced by the study of the human being. So again, the focus is more, they're not totally shirking God and religion. In fact, much of the art will continue to be, many glorious works are religious in nature, but they're also increasingly interested in people. I just wanted to mention a popular philosophy of the time, which is called Neoplatonism, the New Platonism, looking back to both Plato and some other important ancient Greek writers. But Neoplatonism, there were a number of philosophers actually living in Florence. They had an academy, kind of a think tank. We have some of their writings, and we know what they had in mind and what they were emphasizing. And in those writings, they talk about the importance of observing beauty, and that could be everything from beautiful architecture, beautiful paintings, beautiful music or literature, and using the mind. And they really talked extensively about those two things, beauty and reason, as a way to elevate oneself toward a higher order of being. Sometimes they almost hint at becoming godlike, but it's this idea that by contemplating beauty and using your mind, you will make yourself better. And that philosophy really is at least lurking in the shadows throughout the Renaissance, and sometimes it's even more prominent than that. But this idea that beauty and the mind, we might say, will make you better, will improve you. I find it interesting and helpful, actually. Francis Schaeffer, I kind of allude at the top of the screen here, How Should We Live? Francis Schaeffer wrote a book called How Should We Then Live? Borrowing from an Old Testament verse, but in that book, which was very helpful in its day, I think it was published in the 70s, it's rather dated now, unfortunately, but in that book, he talks about the Renaissance, talks about the development of culture, and says that much of what the Renaissance was doing, and when you see this screen here about cultivating oneself, focusing on beauty, using the mind, he said many of these things were very good and very much something that Christians could applaud. It was just that at times they went too far, and it ultimately, and we would see in later centuries, becomes more of a god, something that people come to worship these things rather than seeing them as a means to an end. But I think it's helpful to keep Schaeffer's comment in mind that in and of themselves, these things are not bad. They certainly can get out of hand, but wanting to cultivate oneself, valuing beauty and the mind certainly are very Christian qualities and things that we would applaud. It's just a caution that he gives that sometimes these things can be taken too far. So some of the things that were happening during this time, I've referred to here key events and accomplishments. I said there's a lot of energy during this time. A lot is going on. First of all, the fall of Constantinople. Now that doesn't happen until the middle of the 1400s, as does the printing press. But the fall of Constantinople is interesting because it falls to the Ottoman Turks. And what happened, the situation was that in Constantinople, there were many scholars who had preserved Greek language and many ancient Greek manuscripts. And so they had really taken it as their mission to really preserve ancient Greek things, we'll say. And when the Turks came in, those people knew that this was not going to be a hospitable environment for them. And so they left, and they heard that Florence would be a hospitable place. And so they ended up, many of them, settling in Florence. And so you have this sort of shot in the arm. The Renaissance is already going on. There's already an interest in things Greco-Roman. And you have these scholars who show up with additional information, with additional literature from ancient times, writings from ancient times. And so it's one of those sort of shots in the arm for the Renaissance. We also have increased literacy, a love of learning and using the mind. And the printing press really, as you have a culture that really values learning and thinking and growing, the printing press, of course, is going to greatly fuel that desire. This is also the time of global exploration, ultimately people like Columbus, and so this exploration of the planet and the excitement of that and what they are learning from that, so it's a time of that. It is also a time of exploring, as it were, the solar system with people like Copernicus, and so more and more knowledge is being amassed. Whether it's knowledge of this world or even of the heavens, there's more and more fascination and a desire to learn and to grow. And so we see it in the sciences as well. We also see an increasing fascination with the human body, with anatomy, and with related aspects of the medical field. This is Vesalius here, who's often called the father of modern human anatomy. And so this, again, desire to know, a desire to understand, whether it be, again, the globe, the solar system, the human body. And then the last example I have, I've loosely called technology here. It's This is said to be the first painting we have showing a person wearing eyeglasses, and it actually comes a little bit before the 1400s, but it would loosely be considered within this time period. And it's a good example of the Renaissance mindset. Because again, I mentioned that can-do spirit. The thinking was, don't just accept a problem, try to figure it out. And so in this case, a problem of not seeing as well, rather than just accepting that one's eyesight is failing, someone tried to figure out, okay, if we grind these lenses, we can improve the situation. So it's using the mind to make life better. And that is something that's very typical of the Renaissance spirit. Including the arts. We often say that the Renaissance in the arts, we certainly say that the Renaissance begins in Italy and specifically in Florence. It is generally said that it begins right here with this little white-capped structure, which is the baptistry in Florence. Church constructions at this point in Italy typically had three parts. You would have the church, especially if it were a major cathedral like this one. You would have the cathedral. You would have a separate bell tower, and by the way, Giotto designed this one. And then you would have a separate structure in front of that where baptisms would take place. The same thing, I mentioned this tower. Everyone is familiar with the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, and I always encourage people to say, if you get to go there sometime, don't just look at the Leaning Tower. The church and the baptistry are also very significant and quite beautiful, but that's another place where you have those three things. You have the church, the tower, which of course in that case, the Leaning Tower of Pisa being quite famous, but you have the church, the tower, and the separate baptistry. And here, the authorities in Florence determined that the baptistry needed new doors. I love this photograph. Here you see again the cathedral, the bell tower, and our focus right now, the baptistry. So the authorities in Florence announced a competition in the early 1400s. They said, we need new doors for this building. It actually has several locations for doors, but we need a new set for one particular area, new set of doors. We would like folks to enter a competition, which even right there is a Renaissance thing. Earlier, quite often, someone would just be appointed to create a work of art. Someone would just say, hello, I know you're an artist, I like your work, I would like you to do this particular project. But in the Renaissance, we see it in politics, we see it in financial matters. There's a lot of competition, and there's competition in the arts as well. And so rather than just giving the commission to someone, they made people fight for it, basically. So they announced this competition for the doors. They said, we want anyone who is entering, everyone has to apply, and you have to create a work of art as your test piece, as your application. It will need to have this shape, it's called a quatrefoil, but a specific shape, a specific size, and it needs to tell a specific story, the Old Testament story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Several people entered, but we ended up with a tie. Two people created works, and at first the judges were not really able to determine between the two. They eventually did make a decision for a winner, but at first it was very, very close, and we could say it was a draw for a bit. We do have those competition panels. They're in a museum in Florence, and here you see Ghiberti on the left and Brunelleschi's competition panels for those doors. You can see now what I mean, the same size and shape, and again telling the same story. So of course you know the Old Testament story, Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and his wife Sarah had desperately wanted a child. They finally are able to have a child in their old age. They really, of course, dote on this child. And then God commands Abraham to take that only child, a type, of course, of Christ, but to take that only child up to the mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. And so Abraham does. He takes, in this case, we see some pack animals and servants, takes the boy, and they make their way up to the mountain where he starts to offer him as a sacrifice. Just in the nick of time, an angel appears, says, "You have passed the test. You have shown you were willing to do this, therefore you will not have to do this." God has provided a substitute sacrifice in the form of a ram. Both artists showed all of those things. So you have the journey, we could say. We have servants and a pack animal. Over here, we have servants and a pack animal. We then have what we could call the sacrifice scene, where we have Abraham and Isaac, and also over here, Abraham and Isaac. We have the angel in both, and we have the ram in both. So they included the very same things. They obeyed the instructions in terms of size and shape and story. And they both did a really nice job in many respects. But ultimately, only one person could create the doors. And so eventually, Ghiberti was chosen the winner. I always say, as a handy way to keep that straight, think of G for good, Ghiberti, and B for bad, Brunelleschi, at least at this point. And so the situation in terms of good, I'm thinking in terms of the perspective of the judges. And so they decided this was good, this was bad. It was the losing competition piece. We know who won. We know that Ghiberti went on to finish that set of doors that was commissioned, and then he went on. He really spent his whole life focusing on doors. They were very time-consuming, and so he really made a name for himself with this great accomplishment. So we know he won. We know he pursued the assignment, the commission, but we don't know exactly what the judges were thinking. We don't know why. Nothing has ever been found in terms of some sort of a journal or some sort of deliberation, some sort of a record as to what the judges discussed and how they made their final decision. But we tend to think that Ghiberti won because his work was closer to the Renaissance. The Renaissance is just beginning at this point, but the Renaissance spirit is already kicking in. And if they're looking back to Greece and to Rome and what they valued, and looking back to anatomy and the mind and realism being accurate, Ghiberti does win. Although I quite often in class take a vote and ask, if you were the judge, which would you prefer? I must say Brunelleschi always wins in a modern day vote. But back then, again, for whatever reasons, Ghiberti won. But let me walk through why he probably won. First of all, anatomy, the body beautiful. We've talked about the Greek focus on the body. If you look here at Isaac and you look at Isaac over here, this work is perhaps more realistic. We see the knife at the throat, his head, his body is contorted, almost looks as if his rib cage is kind of bashed in because of the awkward pose, whereas this is sort of a model A+ example of Greek style anatomy. Now, it might not be very realistic. If your father has a knife to your throat, you probably aren't going to stick your chest out and pose the way this seems to be. But nevertheless, on the part of the judges, they would have no doubt appreciated this Greek style body beautiful. So that's probably one of the reasons. Another thing would be the arrangement of space with less distractions. What Ghiberti has done is to basically arrange his panel almost like a kindergarten classroom. And what I mean by that is that there are zones. There is the servant area, There is the sacrifice area. The angel has a space to be. The ram has a space to be. In a way, everything is orderly. It is neat and tidy. And so it adds to the calm of the work. And I mentioned there are less distractions. The servants were helpful, but they aren't that important to the story. Brunelleschi, on the other hand, puts the servants right up in our face, very skillfully done, but he puts them front and center. And actually, everything here is what we call close to the picture plane, meaning that every object is pretty much close to us in about the same amount. And so it actually comes across as a little bit more cluttered. And so rather than, again, more distracting, as opposed to everything in its place over here. Related to that, we could also say that Ghiberti is more skillful with the use of perspective, which is interesting because Brunelleschi ends up being the one to demonstrate how perspective works. But with this outcropping of rock here, we have a sense, for example, that the ram is quite a bit further away. It's flatter and it sort of leads our eye, that rock sort of leads our eye back to the background. Whereas here, the ram is right at Isaac's knee. You almost think he should say, you know, Dad, I think I have an idea here. There's this ram that keeps sort of nuzzling my knee here. And so again, we don't have as much of a sense of depth. We don't have as much of a sense of perspective. Another thing would be calm versus emotion. The Renaissance, looking back to classical Greece, would value calm, not so much the emotions. Brunelleschi's work seems charged with emotion. You can see the drapery blowing here. Abraham almost seems to be falling forward, and so there's that sense of sort of unsteadiness, and again the drapery and the angel rushing in, and even the angel's drapery is blowing in the breeze. The knife is literally at the throat, and so it's much edgier. There's much more of a sense of anticipation and last minute and where's the angel been and what's going to happen, edge of our seats. Whereas here, it's again neat, tidy, calm. There's almost a quiet that pervades the work. That might not strike us as all that appropriate for the story, perhaps. And I think that's why often when I take a vote, the Brunelleschi is the favored work, because it seems to fit that edgy, upsetting quality of the story. But in the Renaissance value system, this work would be preferred. And finally, craftsmanship. To us, both of these works look perfectly fine. They look very well crafted. The judges were able to look at both the front panels and the back, and when they looked at the back of these, they saw that Ghiberti had actually cast this out of one piece of bronze, whereas Brunelleschi put his together with individual pieces like a puzzle. Again, to us, we might say, well, that's okay, whatever. But to the judges, it said that Ghiberti, and he was more trained, more experienced with working with metal, and therefore he would be more skillful, more efficient, actually, with his work. And so one of the other reasons they probably chose him was because he had the greater craftsmanship in this kind of work. So he wins the commission and he creates that first set of doors. He then is asked to create another set. Michelangelo saw them. Michelangelo spending a lot of time in Florence, and when he saw these doors, he said, why, they are worthy to be the gates of paradise, the gates to heaven. And so that name has stuck. So this second set of doors has always been referred to as the gates of paradise. I want to look at one panel of the gates of paradise. In those doors, you have multiple panels, again, of biblical stories. He now is taking more of a square shape rather than that quatrefoil type shape. But I wanted to highlight some things, in particular, his use of perspective with this particular work. Now, I'm going to walk through the story, and you certainly don't have to keep track of all these different portions of this rather elaborate Bible story, but I wanted just to walk through this so you can see how involved this actually is and the skill with which Ghiberti portrays this and tells the story. So this is another Old Testament story of Jacob and Esau. It's specifically an Old Testament story of treachery from the book of Genesis. And there are multiple scenes. Next time we'll introduce the term continuous narrative, and that's what's going on here as well, that there are many different scenes, all part of the same story. And so multiple scenes. So Isaac, who was not sacrificed, grows up and marries Rebekah. She is pregnant with twins. And so here in the first part of the story, Rebekah has a vision or a dream that the twins she is carrying will grow up to be in conflict. Over here in low relief in the background, the twins are born, and they do end up having very different personalities, very different interests. They grow up, and they do show Esau, for example, is the outdoorsman. And so here we see a scene where Isaac is sending Esau out hunting. Here is Esau, and you also see the hunting dogs. Esau obeys, and it's interesting. Here he is, same person. This is Esau. Here is Esau heading out to go hunting, so he is obeying. And then over here, very flat relief shows us again, he looks quite determined right here, but here he is again continuing on his assignment, on his mission. So he obeys, having been asked to go out hunting and bring back meat for some porridge. In the meantime, Rebekah back here is plotting with her favored son, Jacob, and the whole Old Testament idea of the birthright and who was born first would get the birthright. And so that would have gone to Esau, but she's helping to plot some trickery. And so Rebekah plots with Jacob, and then in the last scene, while Rebekah watches, the birthright is given to the wrong person. And so all of these different scenes working together. Now what I'd like you to notice would be the organization. So again, we have these multiple scenes, that kindergarten classroom, as I said, the different zones. We have very skillful treatment of anatomy, including perspective. And so again, Greek influence. And then what I want to talk about a moment, linear perspective. And we'll highlight that again in a moment. So linear perspective more officially stages a comeback. We sometimes say it really is invented in the Renaissance. They certainly do come to use it very, very heavily, starting in the early 1400s until about 1860. And with the Impressionists, we'll begin to get away from linear perspective, although certainly many artists have continued to use it even to the present day. But for about 400 plus years, it was the way you created a painting. Whatever else you were doing in terms of subject matter, color, style, whatever, you would use linear perspective. But as I'll mention in a moment, it had been used before. The concept of linear perspective is what we often refer to as a window on the world. Think of it as if you're looking through a window and the artist's job is to organize what he or she wants you to see, as if you were looking through that window and getting a realistic, believable portrayal of it. A theorist of the time said that the artist paints on a surface which is an open window through which I view that which will be painted there. So that's another little more elaborate way of saying what I was saying. Think of it as if you're looking out a window, and the artist is thinking that way and wanting to make the scene very visually convincing. And we're going to see that what they're doing is determining some techniques to make that happen, to make it look believable. Brunelleschi demonstrated it. There actually was a theorist at the time who wrote a book about it, a treatise about it. But Brunelleschi actually got some friends together in Florence and demonstrated how it works. It was, though, known by the Greeks and the Romans. And I'll show you some examples in just a moment. So the ancients knew this, and then for about 1,000 years, either it was forgotten or the priorities were just different. And so there was sort of silence on linear perspective for a very long time. There are two basic principles, really not that complicated. Objects in the distance appear smaller. So they're really just observing how things look. That if a person or an object, a tree or whatever, is further away, it will look smaller, and parallel lines seem to converge toward a vanishing point in the distance. So even though you might know that the sides of the road or the sidewalk, the train tracks, are always going to stay equidistant, as you look off into the distance, those parallel lines look as if they're meeting at a point. And so those are the two main principles that they used. That was really the foundation of linear perspective. It fits the Renaissance emphasis on science, math, and the mind. These were the things that were valued, and so now artists felt they had some increased legitimacy because they were using the latest scientific techniques. And so it really gave them some legitimacy as a part of this think tank that was the Renaissance. And so giving them legitimacy in terms of science, math, and the use of the intellect. And the interesting thing is that this isn't at all just important for painting or relief sculpture. Relief sculpture uses the same principles, but it isn't just an art thing. Those decisions, those discoveries, as it were, or at least bringing back those ideas, were very influential for scale drawings, maps, charts, graphs, diagrams, things like architectural drawings. And it's no accident that it's during this time period that the Italians were known as great map makers. This is a modern day version of a map by Toscanelli, as you see, from 1474. It's just a modern version of what their understanding is of what he created as a map. And this map went with Columbus across the Atlantic. So this development and perspective made that possible. The knowledge of how to plot places on a graph or a diagram, a map, was very, very important for many things, including map making, cartography. So I just wanted to reiterate that it was not totally a new invention or a discovery, well, we could say, I guess, a discovery, but a discovery from the past. The Greeks, we don't have a lot of paintings from the Greeks, but we do have pots, pottery, and you can see here, for example, several horses, and they have very skillfully shown that some horses, one is closer to us, don't know how well you can tell there, but others are further away, and the bodies and the legs overlapping. And there are a number of Greek vases where someone might be sitting in a chair, or they might be opening a jewelry box, and that box or that chair look very convincing in terms of linear perspective. And then I included, this is a painting actually from the villa where the sculpture, the Augustus of Prima Porta, was located, Prima Porta being Augustus's wife's villa. And this was a wall painting of an orchard. And you can see again, for example, the fence here. And you can tell that this tree is closer to us, and then the fence, and then the fruit trees. And so again, and this was very common in Italy, places like Pompeii. They loved to decorate their walls, as we've said, with paintings, and quite often they would have fun, as it were, with architectural drawings. And so again, we can see that use of perspective. So I just wanted to reiterate that it was known in the past, but for whatever reason was forgotten for about 1,000 years. So here we come back to Ghiberti and his Gates of Paradise, and this is a detail of the work we were looking at, Jacob and Esau. And I just wanted to reiterate those two principles of perspective: objects in the distance appearing smaller and parallel lines seeming to converge at a point. You see here, this is Esau, and as I pointed out earlier, this is Esau. You can see he's much smaller, and because this is relief sculpture, they can also use depth, and so he's also flatter to suggest again that he's further away. So using those principles, or one of the principles of perspective. The other thing, parallel lines seem to converge at a point. They did not have to do this, but a lot of times in the early usage of perspective in the Renaissance, they literally would put lines on the floor like tiles, like a tile floor. And you can see, therefore, this tile is larger, and then you can see how the lines of the tiles, which of course would be the same size, but they seem to recede toward a point in the distance. So when we say that Ghiberti is using those principles, that's what we mean. He's using knowledge of both of those two important concepts. Now I have these in your notes as just one more example of what perspective does. And we could say here, these are two city views. And they were chosen. I chose those intentionally. They're both two views of cities, one from the 1300s, and this is not by Giotto, but it was by someone who painted in his style. You don't need to worry about all those titles and artist names, but it's in the style of Giotto and in his relative time period. And so it's approximate perspective. We can tell it's a fairly large city and lots of hustle and bustle and a lot of buildings, and at a glance they seem pretty convincing. But then when we look more carefully, for example, we see this city wall that seems to be like a piece of paper sort of folding. It doesn't look very substantial or convincing. And as we look at the buildings, I think this is a particularly good example. It looks like a triumphal arch. And at a glance, it looks solid, it looks three-dimensional, and you have the feeling that it is receding into the distance. But then as you begin to look, you begin to realize that some of the parallel lines don't go in the correct directions. It just looks off. It just looks a bit awkward. Doesn't quite work. And it's fun to actually spend some time with this work, looking at the different buildings and seeing what does seem to be successful and some other areas that are more awkward, that just seem off a bit. The work at the bottom, we don't know actually who did it. It's said to be from the school of Piero della Francesca, meaning that it might have been one of his students or something. It's interesting, Piero della Francesca was a painter. He also was a mathematician, and that was very common during this time period. And so what this person is doing, this was probably not meant to be a finished painting. It was more like a practice using perspective. And so we see this circular building in the middle, and then we have a large kind of a piazza here, and then buildings on each side. And you'll notice that there, the lines, including, again, tiles on the ground here, do seem to be receding toward a point in the distance, as do the edges of the building. And he's even been aware of light and how, let's say, the light is shining from our left, and so the sun is shining, and these buildings are more in the sunshine. These are more in shadow, so that looks more convincing. But mostly it's buildings that are further away are smaller, and parallel lines seem to be receding to the distance. And what it does is to make a work that holds together more convincingly. It's tighter. It's, again, more visually believable than this work. And so this one is approximate depth, approximate perspective, but not yet having a mathematical technique. This work is using the knowledge. This is 1480, so very much had the knowledge of perspective, and so using those principles to great effect. Well, Ghiberti won the competition for the baptistry doors. Brunelleschi lost. He was not a happy camper. He stomped off to Rome, where he spent about a dozen years, decided on a career change, spent his time in Rome studying ancient architecture. And as they say, the rest is history.